Hi everyone. So today I'll be looking at the other formative requirements that are essential in creating an agreement. Now, when we look at an agreement will have the legally enforceable contract if it is certain, if the terms are complete, and if the parties have the intention to create legal relations. Now, this means if the terms are not settled by the parties by having the certainty, completeness, and the intention, the agreement will not become a contract. Moving on to the first requirement, which is certainty of terms. A statement will become an offer only if it is certain. In other words, the parties who have entered into the contract should ensure that the terms and conditions which they enter into are certain. The reason is that if the terms are vague or uncertain, even the courts are not in a position of interpreting the particular term based on law. This we observe in the case of Scammell versus Austin. Now, in this case, the parties had entered into a contract and they specifically stated that they are entering into a hire purchase agreement. But it was held the term hire purchase agreement or hire purchase term is supposed to be vague. Now, this does not mean that if the parties who enter into the contract have certain uncertainties found in the terms and conditions, that all the time the contract will be void, because there are certain exceptional grounds where the courts would disregard the uncertainty and allow the parties to enter into contract. Now we are looking at the exceptions to the first requirement, which is uncertain. There, if the term in issue is an insignificant one, then of course the courts would ignore the uncertainty. Secondly, by observing the customary trade practices, like in the case of Hillas versus Arcus, or if the parties have disregarded their uncertainty and carried out their terms and obligations towards one another. In these three exceptional grounds, the uncertainty found in the term will not be a barrier preventing the parties from continuing their obligations. Second requirement that we are observing is completeness. Completeness means there should be no room for parties to decide on the terms and conditions subsequently. In other words, everything should be decided by the parties beforehand and should be found on the agreement. Now here also we have to bear in mind that if the agreement is incomplete, once again, courts being a third party or outsider to the particular agreement has no power in dictating terms. But once again, we have some exceptional circumstances where the courts will disregard the particular incompleteness of the agreement and allow the parties to continue with their contract. One such situation is by observing the conduct of the parties. Here also I would refer to the case of Hillas versus Arcus. Now in this case, the two parties were buying and selling timber for a long period of time, and the type of timber that they bought was softwood. But in this particular contract, the type of timber was not mentioned, which means the contract is incomplete. But when the matter went before the court, it was identified that although the contract did not have specified the type of timber, since the parties have been dealing with one particular type of timber, this time also they ought to have decided to continue with the same type. The second exceptional circumstance is if the parties have decided to perform the obligations as it was. Thirdly, by observing the methods of dealing by the parties. Then we move on to the third formative requirement, that is intention to create legal relations. Now, when we look at intention to create legal relations, it's very important for us to know what the two parties have intended when they entered into the contract. Now here the courts will be vigilant about the nature of the agreement, the context and the circumstances. By observing these criteria, the courts will be able to determine whether the parties had in fact decided to enter into a contract or not. Now, in observing agreement, we have two different types of agreements: domestic agreements and commercial agreements. Now, in domestic agreement, from the word itself, it's clear that we are looking at people who share their obviously personal information with one another, or those who have strong bonds like parents and children, spouses, siblings, friends, relatives. So here you can't classify that every time domestic agreement is between only the blood relatives. It can be even non-blood relatives, right? Friends and of course spouses. Now the importance in identifying whether it's a domestic or a commercial agreement is that it's completely based on two presumptions. That is, if it is a domestic agreement, the general presumption is that the parties have not intended to create legal relations, because whatever a statement made by one particular domestic party towards another is never intended to be binding. Now let me show you this through this landmark case called Balfour versus Balfour. In this case, the husband had made a promise to the wife to pay her £30 per month when he was living abroad. Now, at the moment he had made the promise to send the money to the wife, of course the husband nor the wife had intended to create legal relations, because the wife did not want to allow the husband to go abroad leaving her, and also just to console the wife, the husband would have made the particular promise. So it was completely made with good intention, just as a domestic person, where we don't have the intention to create legal relations. But on the other hand, if you look at a commercial agreement, in commercial agreements, yes, of course, the parties intend to create legal relations, because generally we believe that businessmen deal with one another at their arm's length. So any slightest delay that would take place would result in a legally enforceable contract. It's also important for us to bear in mind that these are simply presumptions. Presumptions can be rebutted. They are not fixed. So as a consequence, the presumption in domestic agreement can be rebutted, like in the case of merit versus merit. Now in this case, the spouse who were living separately had entered into an agreement. That is, the husband had placed a signature on a document promising to pay a particular amount of money to the wife. This agreement was signed by the parties at a neutral place, which is at the husband's vehicle. And of course, the fact that the parties were living separately shows that they do not have that domestic strong bond between them. So there we see, the moment the man had signed on the document, he intended the agreement to be a legally enforceable one, and it's the same with the wife. On the other hand, if I am to look at the rebuttal of the presumption in commercial agreements, in commercial agreements, the presumption can be rebutted only if you have used clear, precise words in the contract, where you have expressly prevented the court from interfering and changing the particular term of the contract. This we observe in the case called Rose and Frank versus Crompton. So I hope that this brief summarized version on other formative requirements was helpful to you all. Have a good day. Thank you.